Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carlos DeBrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, September 11th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est, Odisse cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. It's September 11th, the anniversary, 17 years ago, of a series of 4 coordinated attacks in the U.S. by the Islamic group Al-Qaeda in New York City, Pennsylvania, that's United Flight 93, and the Pentagon. 1-year-olds on that day are eligible to vote in this November's election, but they will have no real choice, especially no choice against war, since both parties are promoting it for the 1%'s profits. America's parody of democracy offers personalities and skin types rather than any real choice on war and the economy. Those matters are decided by the American economic elite, the 1%, and communicated to the voters by the top-down political parties. They will continue what all administrations have offered for 40 years, more war and more inequality, with the profits of U.S. wars and war provocations flowing to the rich at an accelerating rate. 17 years ago, the 9/11 attacks occurred in the context of the ongoing attacks by the U.S. in the Mideast in its attempts to control Mideast energy resources. The 9/11 attacks were counterattacks. The presumed perpetrators, the Osama bin Laden organization, said that the attacks were in response to 3 U.S. actions in particular: U.S. sanctions against Iraq, which President Clinton's Secretary of State admitted had killed 500,000 children, but was worth it; 2, the oppression of the Palestinians by Israel; and 3, the presence of U.S. troops in the Muslim Holy Lands to control the Mideast. In fact, the greatest crime of the century so far, the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, which may have killed 1 million people, had nothing to do with 9/11, although the U.S. government tried to pretend it did. The U.S. invasion, based on American government lies about weapons of mass destruction, was part of the generations-long campaign by the U.S. to control Mideast gas and oil by military force. The poets often get there first. W.H. Auden wrote in his poem about the outbreak of World War II, September 1st, 1939, quote, "I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return." Hence the evil of 9/11. Today, the president is talking peace with North Korea and Russia, but American liberals and neocons within the administration are appalled that peace might break out, because the profits of America's 1% depend on the U.S. government's maintaining American economic control of the world, and the way they do it is by threats of war against Russia and China, their peer competitors, as it's called in the foreign policy business. You may have noticed that when Trump and the leader of North Korea talked peace in Singapore, defense stocks, as they're called, it means weapons makers, declined sharply. So the U.S. is today making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them surrounding Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. An international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is try to encourage our fellow citizens to become aware of the killing our government is doing around the world in our name. We're involved in great crimes and must stop. Today I want to talk, first of all, about the most recent examples of this U.S. war-making, which strangely doesn't really make it to the evening news or to the standard broadcasts of mainstream media. President Trump issued a statement recently warning, quote, that he's going to get very, very angry if the upcoming Syrian offensive against al-Qaeda, the group, after all, that perpetrated 9/11, al-Qaeda in Idlib province, end up slaughtering civilians. Trump threatened to respond, quote, swiftly and appropriately. This is an expansion of previous comments and threats from the administration about the Idlib offensive, in which Syria hopes to reclaim the last rebel-held territory in the country. Now remember who these rebels are. These rebels are jihadists, Muslim radical terrorists, whom the U.S. paid to overthrow the government of Syria, the legitimate government of Syria, the government of President Assad, and then the U.S. inserted its own troops into Syria as well, quite illegally. The U.S. has no right to be in Syria. But the so-called Syrian civil war was constructed by the U.S. to overthrow a government, the government in Damascus, that would not take American orders. In recent days, the U.S. has threatened to attack Syria if chemical weapons are used against this last area dominated by the rebels whom the U.S. paid to attack the Syrian government. Trump's threat to respond now appears to be no longer conditional on any chemical use and comes after other administration officials have declared that they're opposed to any offensive against the rebels at all and will view them all as an escalation of the war. That is, they're opposed to Syrian government reclaiming its territory from this insurgency paid for by the United States. Syrian and Russian forces have shelled and launched airstrikes against this Idlib region, the region where these rebels are now finally concentrated, in recent days. But there is as yet no public timetable for the ground offensive for Syria to reconquer its territory. It is not uncommon for Syria to try to soften up rebel territories with shelling while trying to negotiate a surrender before resorting to ground invasion. Last week, Trump said of Syrian President Bashar Assad's campaign to recapture this last stronghold of the rebellion, Idlib, quote, if it's a slaughter, the world is going to get very, very angry, and the United States is going to get very angry too, close quote. In a front-page story last Monday, headlined, Assad is planning chlorine attack, U.S. says, the Wall Street Journal reported that during a recent meeting, quote, President Trump threatened to conduct a massive attack against Mr. Assad if he carries out a massacre in Idlib, close quote. The Idlib region contains 3 million civilians and refugees and 70,000 rebels, 10,000 of whom are al-Qaeda. Finally, the Washington Post reported that Trump is changing U.S. policy. A week ago last Friday, the Washington Post reported that Trump is changing U.S. policy. America will not be leaving Syria anytime soon. Remember, Trump became president in part because he attacked the war-making of the Obama administration and on different times said that American troops illegally in Syria should be withdrawn. Last week, he announced a change of mind. The 2,200 U.S. troops in Syria will remain until we see, quote, the exit of all Iranian military and proxy forces and the establishment of a stable, non-threatening government acceptable to all Syrians, close quote. We are not in a hurry to go, said James Jeffrey, the retired U.S. Foreign Service officer brought back to handle the Syria account. The new policy is we're no longer pulling out by the end of the year, close quote. I have an example here of the administration reversing what Trump has been saying since the campaign. President Obama had a red line against Syria's use of poison gas, which Trump enforced with bombing runs. Now we have a new red line. Said Jeffrey, the U.S., quote, will not tolerate an attack, period. In an editorial Friday, the Post goaded Trump, calling his response to Assad's ruthless recapture of his country pathetically weak. To stand by and let the Syrian army annihilate the rebels in Idlib, said the Post, would be another damaging abdication of U.S. leadership. On this anniversary of 9/11, the U.S. issues these ringing defenses of al-Qaeda, the group that apparently carried out the 9/11 2001 attacks. What Trump seems to be signaling, the Post demanding, and Jeffrey, the Foreign Service man, suggesting, is that rather than allow a bloody battle for the recapture of Idlib province to play out, the United States should engage Russian and Syrian forces militarily and force them to back off. On Friday, near the U.S. garrison at Tanf in southern Syria, close to Iraq, U.S. Marines conducted a live fire exercise. The purpose: warn Russian forces to stay away. Russia forces are in Syria, of course, quite legally, invited by a legitimate government, and preventing the American-sponsored insurrection from overthrowing that government. The Americans have declared a 35-mile zone around Tanf, this garrison in southern Syria, off limits. The Marine exercise followed a Russian notification and U.S. rejection of a plan to enter the zone in pursuit of terrorists. Is Trump ready to order U.S. action against Russian and Syrian forces if Assad gives his army the green light to take Idlib? The bombing of Idlib has already begun. What makes this more than an academic exercise is that Vladimir Putin and Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, at a meeting in Tehran last Friday, told President Erdogan of Turkey that the reconquest of Idlib is going forward. Erdogan fears that the Syrian army's recapture of Idlib would send hundreds of thousands more refugees streaming to his border, that is, the border of Turkey. Turkey already hosts millions of refugees from Syria's civil war. Once again, it's a civil war because the U.S. backs the terrorists. Yet the massing of the Syrian army near Idlib and the Russian and Syrian bombing now begun suggests that the Assad-Putin-Rouhani coalition, Syria, Russia, and Iran, has decided to accept the risk of a clash with the Americans in order to bring an end to the rebellion of the jihadis. If so, this puts the ball in America's court. Words and warnings aside, is Trump prepared to take us into the Syrian civil war against the forces who, without our intervention, would have won the war? When did Congress authorize a new war? What vital U.S. interest is imperiled in Idlib, or in ensuring that all Iranian forces and Shiite allies are removed, or that, quote, a non-threatening government acceptable to all Syrians and the international community, as Trump says, is established in Damascus? With these conditions required before our departure, we could be there for eternity. The Syrian civil war is arguably the worst humanitarian disaster of the decade. The sooner it is ended, the better. But Assad, Russia, and Iran did not start this war, nor have Syria, Russia, or Iran sought a clash with U.S. forces, whose mission, we are repeatedly assured, was to crush ISIS and go home. Trump has struck Syria twice for the use of poison gas. Question about whether the use of poison gas happened at all. And U.S. officials told the Wall Street Journal that Assad has now approved the use of chlorine on the rebels in Idlib. Moscow, however, is charging that a false flag operation to unleash chlorine on civilians in Idlib is being prepared to trigger and justify U.S. intervention. Many in this Russia-phobic city, the author is referring to the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., many in this Russo-phobic city would welcome a confrontation with Putin's Russia, even more a U.S. war on Iran. But that is the opposite of what candidate Trump promised. It would represent a triumph of the never-Trumpers and President Trump's relinquishing of his foreign policy to the interventionists and neoconservatives. Ron Paul, one of the few recent presidential candidates who has really talked about withdrawing American troops from the wars that were expanded by the last president. President Obama was the first president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. Ron Paul wrote this week, "Last week I urged the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor to stop protecting al-Qaeda in Syria by demanding that the Syrian government leave Idlib under al-Qaeda control. While it may seem hard to believe that the U.S. government is helping al-Qaeda in Syria, perhaps particularly on September 11th, it's not as strange as it may seem. Our interventionist foreign policy increasingly requires Washington to partner up with bad guys in pursuit of its dangerous and aggressive foreign policy goals. Does the Trump administration actually support al-Qaeda and ISIS? Of course not. But the experts, in quotes, who run Trump's foreign policy have determined that a de facto alliance with these 2 extremist groups is for the time being necessary to facilitate the more long-term goals of the U.S. in the Mideast. And what are those goals? Regime change for Iran. Let's have a look at the areas where the U.S. is turning a blind eye to al-Qaeda and ISIS. First, Idlib. As President Trump's own special envoy to fight ISIS said just last year that, quote, Idlib province is the largest al-Qaeda safe haven since 9/11, close quote. So why do so many U.S. officials, including President Trump himself, keep warning the Syrian government not to retake its own territory from al-Qaeda control? Wouldn't they be doing us a favor by ridding the area of al-Qaeda? Well, if Idlib is retaken by Assad, it all but ends the neocon and Saudi and Israeli dream of regime change for Syria and a black eye to Syria's ally, Iran. Second, one of the last groups of ISIS fighters in Syria are around the Al-Tanf U.S. military base, which has operated illegally in northeastern Syria for the last 2 years. Last week, according to press reports, the Russians warned the U.S. military in the region that it was about to launch an assault on ISIS fighters around the U.S. base. The U.S. responded by sending in 100 more U.S. Marines and conducting a live fire exercise as a warning. President Trump recently reversed himself again and announced that the U.S. would remain at Al-Tanf indefinitely. Why? It's considered a strategic point from which to attack Iran. The U.S. means to stay there, even if it means turning a blind eye to ISIS in the neighborhood. Finally, in Yemen, the U.S.-Saudi coalition fighting the Houthis has been found by AP and other mainstream media outlets to be directly benefiting al-Qaeda. Why help al-Qaeda in Yemen? Because the real U.S. goal is regime change in Iran, and Yemen is considered one of the fronts in the battle against Iranian influence in the Middle East. So we're aiding al-Qaeda, which did attack us, September 11th, because we want to regime change Iran, which hasn't attacked us. How does that make sense? We all remember the old saying attributed to Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac that if you lie down with dogs, you wake up with fleas. The experts would like us to think they are pursuing a brilliant foreign policy that will provide a great victory for America at the end of the day. As usual, our experts have got it wrong. It's really not that complicated. When winning means you're allied with al-Qaeda and ISIS, you're doing something wrong. Let's start doing foreign policy right. Let's leave the rest of the world alone. That's Pat Buchanan, a so-called paleo-conservative, who is, I think, one of the few American political figures talking sense about what this government is doing. There's an interesting statement by a group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity that's worth looking at. It's made up of former intelligence officers, U.S. intelligence officers, diplomats, military officers, and congressional staffers. The organization, founded in 2002, after the 9/11 attacks, was among the first critics of Washington's justifications for launching a war against Iraq, which we did in 2003. VIPS, the abbreviation of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS advocates a U.S. foreign and national security policy based on genuine national interests rather than contrived threats promoted for largely political reasons. The vast lying by the American government about Iraq is the best example. An archive of VIPS memoranda is available at consortiumnews.com, which I recommend highly if you want to hear what's being left out of our mainstream media accounts. As Syrian forces backed by Russia launched the final showdown in Syria against jihadist extremists in Idlib province, the potential for U.S.-Russia confrontation has never been greater, as VIPS warns in this memo to President Trump. This is a memorandum addressed for the President from Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, subject, Moscow has upped the ante in Syria. Mr. President, we are concerned that you may not have been adequately briefed on the upsurge of hostilities in northwestern Syria, where Syrian armed forces with Russian support have launched a full-on campaign to take back the al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, ISIS-infested province of Idlib. The Syrians will almost certainly succeed, as they did in late 2016 in Aleppo. As in Aleppo, it will mean unspeakable carnage unless someone finally tells the insurgents that theirs is a lost cause. The insurgents are the rebels, the jihadists, the terrorists that the U.S. has been backing. That someone is you. The Israelis, Saudis, and others who want unrest to endure are egging on the insurgents, assuring that you, Mr. President, will use U.S. forces to protect the insurgents in Idlib and perhaps also rain hell down on Damascus. We believe that your senior advisors are encouraging the insurgents to think in those terms, and that your most senior aides are taking credit for your recent policy shift from troop withdrawal from Syria to indefinite war. Russian missile-armed naval and air units are now deployed in unprecedented numbers to engage those tempted to interfere with Syrian and Russian forces trying to clean out the terrorists from Idlib. We assume you've been briefed on that, at least to some extent. More important, we know that your advisors tend to be dangerously dismissive of Russian capabilities and intentions. We do not want you to be surprised when the Russians start firing their missiles. The prospect of direct U.S.-Russian hostilities in Syria is at an all-time high. We are not sure you realize that. The situation is even more volatile because Kremlin leaders are not sure who is calling the shots in Washington. This is not the first time that President Putin has encountered such uncertainty. This is, however, the first time that Russian forces have deployed in such numbers into the area, ready to do battle. The stakes are very high. We hope that John Bolton, National Security Advisor, has given you an accurate description of his acerbic talks with his Russian counterpart in Geneva a few weeks ago. In our view, it is a safe bet that the Kremlin is uncertain whether Bolton faithfully speaks in your stead or speaks instead of you. The best way to assure Mr. Putin that you are in control of U.S. policy toward Syria would be for you to seek an early opportunity to speak out publicly, spelling out your intentions. If you wish wider war, Bolton has put you on the right path. If you wish to cool things down, you may wish to consider what might be called a preemptive ceasefire. By that we mean a public commitment by the presidents of the U.S. and Russia to strengthen procedures to preclude an open clash between U.S. and Russian armed forces. We believe that in present circumstances, this kind of extraordinary step is now required to head off wider war. That's from the group called VIPS, VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, pointing out what's going on in Washington and questioning the recent tergiversations by the president on this matter. They should be listened to. You are listening to Aware on the Air, our program of commentary on the news that is not reported in mainstream media, sponsored by the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I want to turn now to some points raised by our chief researcher, the quite remarkable Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, who has an amazing capacity to listen to those broadcasts and to watch those podcasts and the foreign television and domestic unusual broadcasts that tell us about what's actually happening in the war policy of the United States, ignored as it is by mainstream media. He has a piece here on a reaction that aired on RT, the Russian television system, sort of like the BBC in Britain or France 2 in France. He comments on an article or a broadcast, an interview, a commentary by Samira Khan on Obama's talk here in Champaign last Friday. Obama said in that talk, "When you hear how great the economy's doing right now, let's just remember when this recovery started." He implies that these tributes to the Trump administration on the economy should, in fact, go to his own administration. He shows the real GDP growth figures for Trump at 4.1%, and when Obama left office at 1.8%. The interviewer does, and he asks, in fact, a quick glance at the economic growth chart would suggest these numbers were generally weaker under Obama, although admittedly a number like GDP, gross domestic product, never tells the whole story. Gross domestic product may say something about what profits Wall Street, but as inequality grows and accelerates in this country, it tells you very little indeed about what's happening on Main Street, what's happening to your economy, unless you're a Wall Street banker. What about foreign policy, says the commentator. Obama said, "We helped spread a commitment to certain values and principles, like the rule of law and human rights and democracy." We here, of course, is the Obama administration. The commentator says Obama's supposed commitment to human rights involved turning 2 wars into 7, expanding U.S. military operations from Afghanistan and Iraq to Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan. That's what the Obama administration accomplished. And that policy has only continued under Trump. But surely Obama handled things differently when it came to Russia. Obama said, "Republicans are undermining our alliances, cozying up to Russia." What happened to the Republican Party? Its central organizing principle in foreign policy was the fight against communism, and now they're cozying up to the former head of the KGB, the Russian Secret Service. The commentator says we should point out that Putin was never the head of the KGB, and there was a time when Obama mocked his opponent Mitt Romney for using outdated Cold War language. Obama in October 2012 said to Mitt Romney, When you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia, not Al-Qaeda. You said Russia. And the 1980s are now asking for their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. That was Obama during his campaign against Mitt Romney. But let's go back to Trump cozying up to Russia. How does that actually look? The current president has imposed sanctions on Moscow and has even armed Ukraine. Our commentator, our researcher, Dr. No, says, I'd say Khan, the interviewer, the commentator, raises good points, and this is a useful brief overview of some major problems with Obama's speech. But this could have gone further into detail and cited still more of his speech, including pointing out self-contradictions on freedom of speech and Democratic Party funding and voting to keep Medicare for all away while vaguely supporting it. Many major problems are covered in this commentary. I will post that on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, along with another very good commentary posted on the Aware page earlier by from the World Socialist website. On immigration, there are problems with the recent press critique regarding the Trump immigration policy, which some colloquially call a Muslim ban, because much of that policy has roots in Obama's immigration policy, including a widely republished picture of a child in a cage used to whip up emotional sentiment against current U.S. immigration policy. It's embarrassing for those who pass on this picture that it was taken during Obama's time in office, back when most of the current complainers were silent on the issue. Few news outlets carried the refugees' voices during Obama's time in office, thus raising questions about what the current complaints are really addressing: immigration policy they don't like, or merely complaining about Trump in a corporate-compatible way, designed not to risk asking questions about why these Muslims would seek to leave their countries in the first place. A hint: they're likely escaping the consequences of U.S. foreign policy, like the Obama-era policy to bomb 7 predominantly Muslim countries. The drone war alone clearly qualifies Obama as a war criminal, and the certain values and principles he championed, his phrase, during his time in office apparently included assassinating American citizens without due process. That's in the Constitution if you want to check. Including children. 2 of those Americans are the Alawakis, a father and his 16-year-old son, who were killed in separate drone attacks 2 weeks apart. We're not clear what Anwar, the father, did to deserve extrajudicial and unconstitutional assassination by the Obama administration. We're told he said things the U.S. didn't like, including posting al-Qaeda recruiting materials online. That's al-Qaeda, you remember, the people we're fighting for in Syria right now. But since there was no trial, there were no charges to review, no evidence raised, no chance for rebuttal or debate. When the Obama administration was asked what the 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman, did to deserve being extrajudicially vaporized by a drone missile alongside a set of other innocents with whom he was having dinner, Robert Gibbs, Obama's spokesman, replied, quote, "I would suggest that you should have a far more responsible father if they are truly concerned about the well-being of their children. I don't think becoming an al-Qaeda jihadist terrorist is the best way to go about doing your business," close quote. Amazing comment from the Obama administration about the planned and directed murder of a 16-year-old American citizen without reference to the Constitution's provision that no one can be deprived by the American government of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and said we had drone assassinations from the last administration continued in this one. In 2003, Obama's administration admitted it killed 4 American citizens in Yemen, Pakistan, in drone strikes outside war zones. If Obama cared about law, human rights, and democracy, as he said, Obama would be viewed as a privacy-busting, surveillance state-enlarging war criminal who should be in The Hague awaiting trial for war crimes, not giving speeches, for which we're told he receives over $100,000 per speech, windsurfing with his family, or sitting on the board of a Hollywood production studio. Turn to another issue, campaign funding. Trump's campaign funding is under scrutiny, but what about Hillary Clinton? The clearest description I've seen appears in the Journal of the Federalist of a federal case against HRC and her campaign's money laundering. This is a developing story that looks like it will go largely unreported in the media. It's also worth noting that while Margot Cleveland's description of most media taking no notice of this lawsuit is correct, some non-corporate outlets carry news about this case, and a member of the Committee to Defend the President, the plaintiff in this case, shows up on interviews in non-corporate media from time to time. I take issue whether such media is correctly described as mainstream anymore. It seems to me that as the numbers for TV viewing overall fall and Russiagate favoring CNN's ratings drop precipitously, more Americans turn to online sources, such as social media sites, including getting their news from other people who are not connected with any traditional media outlet. The attempt by the official parties, Republican and Democrat, to control the news by controlling the corporate media is producing at least diminishing returns. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about news affecting America's wars, which is not for the most part heard on this corporate media. In Britain, Boris Johnson, an equivocal figure within the Tory government, may well become head of the Tories, the party that is ostensibly in charge of the British government. He is en route to becoming the next Tory leader in succession, which can happen really at any time, to Prime Minister May. Meanwhile, in America, the question that is being used to try to reverse the decision of the last American president election is Russiagate. The Intercept, a internet news source, had an interview with James Risen, who also writes for The Intercept, by Aaron Mate, under the title, "What Does the Intercept's NSA Leak, National Security Administration, Say About Russian Vote Hacking?" Here's the answer: virtually nothing. The Intercept's own document says that allegations of Russian vote hacking in the U.S. comes down to one person's estimate, which might mean unnamed Russians might be involved in doing something to election-related software organizations. That's a lot of dodgy language for good reason. We don't know as much as the Intercept wants us to take away as a certainty. We don't have the details to believe it's a search for altering election data, as opposed to copying information on voter records for bundling, for sale, or becoming someone's imposter for fraud. And we should say, of course, there's no convictions on any of these points, no clarity on any of these points. We don't have the data to know if this is state-backed or the CIA using their tools for disguising their work and misleading investigations, which WikiLeaks told us about. And in the worst-case scenario, this should push the U.S. towards voter-verified paper ballots, hand-counting said ballots, and being more patient with election results to come out. Every part of Mate's interview is a swing and a miss for Risen. From Risen believing in Russiagate dogma or propaganda, almost 2 years in and no proof of the fundamentals, yet they're still allowed to champion that narrative, to what happened with the Intercept's horrible choice in how to handle reality Winter's leak. Publishing document metadata, which is tantamount to asking the NSA if that's their document, is not a wise choice, but that appears to be what the Intercept did, and why John Kiriakou rightly says, "Don't leak to anyone but WikiLeaks." Only WikiLeaks has the infrastructure and the experienced staff to make the right choices. This is an amazing case. Reality Winner, who has just been given a long prison sentence, was a young woman who leaked, passed on information that supported the Russiagate charges, or seemed to. Information that seemed to suggest that Russian hackers did have some purchase on some aspect of the American election process, electoral machines and so forth. As a result, the United States government has sentenced her to 5 years in prison for leaking information about the very thing that we're told Robert Mueller is busily investigating in order to get Donald Trump. The interview and The Intercept is full of wheels within wheels like this. Mattei, who is a remarkably good reporter, applies some fairly basic logic based in reading the document and applying what it says to Risen's unfounded assertion that this document is a valuable contribution to the Russiagate cause. This is not the first time that Risen has been caught buying into Russiagate lies. See an earlier debate between Glenn Greenwald and Jane Risen on the Trump-Russia investigation. Greenwald basically demolishes Risen's arguments on, one, what treason means. Risen claims that Russiagate will determine if Trump is a traitor. Greenwald is right. Trump isn't being shown to be a traitor or not. We're not at war with Russia. No such war has been declared. So treason, one of the most specifically defined crimes, simply doesn't apply. This also means that when Risen said on MSNBC, quote, "If collusion is proven, then I think almost by definition Trump is a traitor. And I think everyone is afraid of the consequences of using that word because it's so fraught. But I think that's what it is. If you collude with an adversary of the United States to take over the government of the United States, you're a traitor," close quote. To which Greenwald, in the Intercept debate, rebuts, "Right, so I think anyone who reads the Constitution would know that is not the case," close quote. This is a major point against Risen because Risen's entire argument hinges on whether Trump is a traitor as a result of being proven to have colluded with Russia to become U.S. president. Accepting that Russiagate has so much evidence, an unbacked and unquestioned assertion Risen also made with Mattei, I haven't seen this evidence, and what I've seen is indistinguishable from free speech. But Risen says, quote, "The preponderance of evidence today is that the Russians, the Russian intelligence community, and other elements of the Russian government made a decision to get involved in the cyber campaign beginning in 2014 or 2015 without challenge. Collusion is consistently talked about amongst liberals as a crime, but it's not a crime. It's a word that doesn't even actually exist in the law," says Greenwald. There's no law that says collecting dirt on one's political opponent, which is what Trump is accused of doing, is a crime. Risen's phone interview with Mattei finally ends with Risen hanging up the phone on Mattei after saying he has no comment on how the Intercept handled Winner's leak, the leak that got her 5 years in prison. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the coverage of the Russiagate matter and of the foreign policy of the United States, which is remarkably distant from the truth these days. This is, I suppose, nothing new, but it takes someone with the capacity of our own Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, to tell the truth about what is being said along the way in this Russiagate nonsense. The questions are not limited, of course, to Russia. Media attacks on the Latin American broadcasting system Telesur have been encouraged by the American government, and pressure has been put on Facebook in this regard because people are getting more accurate information about the machinations of the U.S. government in Latin America through Facebook and other social media. Venezuela-based Telesur, the broadcasting system, started in 2005 as a joint project between Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro to challenge corporate hegemony in the news. Telesur is promoted as a Latin socialist answer to CNN, one unsympathetic Boston Globe reporter wrote. Telesur receives funding from multiple Latin American governments, chiefly Venezuela, but also Cuba, Nicaragua, Uruguay, and Bolivia. The Obama administration declared Venezuela a national security threat, no doubt due to being the largest oil reserve in the world and one not controlled by the U.S., creating ALBA, founded initially by Cuba and Venezuela in 2004, and trading with their virtual regional currency, the sucre, instead of the U.S. dollar. And in 2015, Obama implemented sanctions against Venezuela. Venezuela was posing what Chomsky calls the threat of a good example, in part by using its oil money without submitting to American warmongering and Wall Street economic policy. Telesur, an ALBA project, a project of this coalition of Latin governments, was able to function under the Obama-era sanctions because Telesur's funders could transfer money through Caracas, through Venezuela. But in 2015, we also learned of a foiled plot to bomb Telesur. After Nicolas Maduro's election in Venezuela, U.S. sanctions restricted banking through Caracas, thus money to Telesur and its reporters stopped, which effectively halted production. The U.S., in other words, strangled a media source that was not under control of a U.S. corporate media. Reporters were on their own to continue their journalism. 2 months ago, Abby Martin started fundraising on GoFundMe and Patreon, and she raised enough money to continue her Telesur-funded show, Empire Files, which I recommended highly. Telesur had been not paying their journalists for 6 months and only began releasing new shows electronically 2 weeks ago. Venezuela reports and Telesur's Facebook accounts were both suspended by Facebook and later reinstated. It's not clear why. The accounts given by Facebook are confusing and conflicting. But it's clear that Facebook's recently announced partnership with the propaganda firm the Atlantic Council in the U.S. is at work. The Empire Files, Abby Martin's program with this checkered past, debunks a recent John Oliver episode, which you would have no trouble seeing in this country, in which Oliver pushes the neoliberal line in order to persuade his viewers Venezuela is an authoritarian state run by madmen, rather than an independent state which is being undermined actively by the United States. Turn to some questions of war here. The U.S. Army is working on drones that never need to land. This might cause some concern by people who are looking at the heritage of the Obama administration, the author of what Noam Chomsky has called the most extreme terrorist campaign in the modern world, that is Obama's drone assassinations. The U.S. Army wants to increase the ability of the U.S. government to do that. It wants drones that never need to land, meaning the drones are recharged in flight from a distance. The specifics of the technology aren't really the interesting part. The interesting part comes from the mass surveillance and killing capability that comes with in-flight recharging power. Active duty war resistor with Martin Preisner of Telesur's Empire Wars and his show's Eyes Left. Preisner is also an Iraq War veteran, an activist who advocates for active-duty war resistors and conscientious objectors, just as done in Vietnam. We've mentioned here before the untold story for most Americans that the reason the U.S. withdrew its ground troops, not of course its aircraft, from Vietnam in 1973 was the revolt of the draft army that the U.S. had sent to Vietnam. The army became unreliable, even attacking its own officers and refusing to fight the Vietnamese in the jungles. That's a story that's not told by series like the News Gazette's series on the memories of veterans, but many veterans are quite aware of what happened, even though it's not part of the official American account of the Vietnam War. The question to this active duty war resistor, Mike Preisner, is there's a long history that they're working actively to cover up about resistance in our military. In Vietnam, there were bodies coming back by the thousands, and it was a type of battle that we don't seem to do as much anymore, where you throw men at it like cannon fodder and watch them come back in flag-draped coffins. Is it tougher to convince people that what they're doing is wrong when it's just pushing a button on a drone bomb, do you think? Preisner, the active duty resistor, says, in my experience over the last 10 years, people of all types in the military have realized that they're a part in what they're a part of in a broader sense. People who care about humanity, people who care about human life and human rights. In fact, several drone pilots that I know of have become conscientious objectors and repudiated their role. Throughout the entire history of the military, there is a history of mutinies, rebellions, and resistance within the ranks, and solidarity with people that we're told who are our enemy. Of course, in Vietnam, that reached a fever pitch, where it's estimated that half of the U.S. Armed Forces were part of the GI resistance movement. Half of the U.S. Armed Forces. I mean, that's no small thing. And that's not at all just draftees. That's volunteers of all ranks and all backgrounds, which built for many years before the draft was even implemented. And so even though today the current war casualties are low in Vietnam, casualties are low in Iraq and Syria, but that can change at any moment. And we know that the Trump administration, especially the same people that brought us to war in Iraq, people like John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, people that should be in a prison cell right now, are now in Trump's ear, convincing him to go to some major war in Korea and Iran. We know that the potential is very near something like that happening, and we want to be ready to tell people on a large scale that they absolutely should not let these rich politicians, who don't care anything about them, throw away their lives and use them as a tool to destroy the lives of millions of people whom we have no reason to fight abroad. There's also more discussion about how veterans are treated if they come back alive. Getting health care is hard. Medicare for all appears to be a solution for all. Former soldiers committing suicide is an ongoing problem. The statistics are remarkable. Dealing with the mental anguish of war for the rest of one's life, and the solutions are left on the shelf, as Ralph Nader has said. Preisner recommends the film Sir, No Sir, that shows that rank-and-file soldiers have the power to shut down the war machine, as they did in Vietnam. I'm happy to say that that film was shown in place of our Friday program, News from Neptune, last week, and is available, in fact, on YouTube. You can find it, and I'll post the link on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Recommended to those reading the Those Who Serve News Gazette series, with views that are far more critical of the war than anything you'll read in the News Gazette, is the show Eyes Left. I'll also put a link to that on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Quick comments on the Indo-Pacific, which is a term that's recently come into prominence in American foreign policy and military propaganda. It refers to the fact that the U.S. and India are discussing closer military ties. Sales of weapons to India is said to be the real goal of these talks. India is the world's largest importer of military weapons and could switch away from purchasing weapons, as it now does, from Russia. That seems to be a goal of the U.S. government, not surprisingly, given whom they're working for. Some final comments about Syria. France has announced they will join a U.S. strike on Syria if a chemical attack occurs. But the U.S. has never seen Syrian militants use Syrian weapons, but that won't stop the al-Nusra and the White Helmets, the U.S.-UK-backed faction, from meeting to discuss faking a chemical attack in Idlib to frame the Assad regime, according to Russia's Defense Ministry spokesman. At the meeting, various possible scenarios for staging a chemical attack against civilians and made to look as if it was carried out by government forces were discussed and approved. All those involved in the staging the attack were to be ready by September. The plan is said to involve 8 barrels of chlorine, which have been delivered to the area. The white helmets are supposed to film the staging. The U.S. claims the Assad government will use chemical weapons as that administration tries to capture Idlib. The OPCW, the UN Chemical Watchdog, says they oversaw the Syrian chemical stockpile, so Syria doesn't have the means to do as the U.S. claims. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley says that militants want to, quote, bomb schools, hospitals, and homes. The British ambassador to the UN, Karen Pierce, said, quote, there are more babies in Idlib than there are terrorists. That may be literally true, but that is obviously not the point. Russian Ambassador Vasily Nevencia accused the U.S. and U.K. of stoking hysteria. Russia says Idlib is, quote, the last major terrorist stronghold in Syria, and geopolitical, not humanitarian concerns are what's on the U.S.-UK agenda. You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Recorded in the studios of Urbana Public Television on September 11th in the 37th week of 2018, another week in which the world can see the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Our show tonight contained material from the VIPS group and J.B. Nicholson, our own Dr. No. See their work on the AWARE Facebook page, along with links to articles referred to tonight. The demonstration against Obama's speech on campus last Friday was taped by Karen Aram and can be seen on the Facebook page for AWARE on the Air as well. There's an open AWARE meeting this coming Sunday, 5 to 6 p.m., at Hammerhead Coffee, University Avenue at Wright Street, on the northwest edge of the campus, which I can say in an unsolicited testimonial has recently added excellent sandwiches. Come for the revolutionary plotting, stay for the panini. 5 to 6 p.m. Sunday, Wright and University. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Particularly, by the way, our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and an inveterate foe of the WikiLeaks revelations, which this liberal Democrat is working to shut up. Now, this is Carl Estabrook from members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.